She had $11 left in this world, a dog with a torn ear, and a stubbornness the whole town of Coldwater Bend had already decided to laugh at. When the auctioneer's gavel came down on Lot 14, a rusted windowless railroad boxcar nobody else wanted, Adeline Fisk raised her hand before her mind had finished deciding, and the crowd behind her broke into open snickering. She had lost the family orchard 8 months before. She had lost her husband 2 winters before that. And now, with her last coins, and her last dog, she had gone and bought a dead train car sitting on a dead spur of track behind the depot, paying good money for what the depot master called scrap on wheels. They said it was the final proof that grief had finally cracked her sense. What none of them saw, what only the dog seemed to notice, was the way old Copper's ears went up, then flattened, then rose again the moment the auctioneer's hammer fell, as if something inside that rusted hull had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally come and listen. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Fisk and her faithful dog Copper. If you have ever been laughed at for holding on to something everyone else called worthless, or if you've ever found a quiet kind of treasure in the parts of life other people overlook, tell us where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to know we're not the only ones who believe the overlooked things are usually the ones worth keeping. To understand why the whole town turned out just to watch her fail, you first had to understand what Adeline Fisk had already survived. She had come to Coldwater Bend as a bride of 19, married to a quiet railroad surveyor named Thomas Fisk, a man who spoke in careful sentences, and loved her in careful steady ways, that never announced themselves but never wavered either. Together they had built a modest peach orchard on 11 acres at the edge of town, land that Thomas's father had claimed in the years right after the rails first came through. For a decade, the orchard had been enough. It fed them, it fed half the town come August, and it gave Adeline a purpose that did not depend on anyone's permission. Then came the winter fever that took Thomas in 11 days, so fast that Adeline barely had time to understand she was becoming a widow before she already was one. She buried him on a Tuesday, and picked the last of the winter apples on a Wednesday, because the trees did not know how to grieve, and someone still had to feed them. For 2 years after that, she managed. She was frugal in a town that mistook frugality for eccentricity, and she was proud in a town that preferred its widows humble. She sold preserves at the mercantile, mended harnesses for the livery, and kept the orchard alive through sheer will, and the same patient stubbornness that had once made Thomas fall in love with her. But an orchard needs capital the way a fire needs air. And when a blight moved through the valley 2 summers running, it took the trees with it, root and branch. The bank, run by a narrow, immaculately dressed man named Silas Pruitt, who had arrived in Coldwater Bend only 3 years prior, and had somehow, in that short time, come to hold the paper on nearly every struggling parcel of land within 20 miles, foreclosed on the orchard on a gray March morning, with an efficiency that felt almost rehearsed. Pruitt did not gloat. That was the worst part. He simply had the papers signed, thanked her for her patience, and had the 11 acres replatted for a lumberyard within the month, as though the orchard's decade of harvests had never happened at all. It was around this time that Copper came into her life, in the unglamorous way most good things do. He had been the runt of a litter belonging to the blacksmith, a rangy red hound with one ear that never stood quite right after a kick from a spooked mule, and nobody had wanted him. Adeline had wanted him precisely because nobody else did. She had lost the orchard, lost the house that came with it, lost most of what people called her prospects, and had moved into 2 rented rooms above the seamstress's shop with nothing to her name but a trunk of Thomas's letters and $11 folded into a handkerchief. Copper slept at the foot of her narrow bed every night, and walked beside her every morning, and if the town had decided she was a foolish woman, now reduced to talking to a dog, then at least the dog, unlike the town, never once looked at her with pity. The 2 rented rooms above the seamstress's shop were narrow and low-ceilinged, with a single window that looked out over the alley, rather than the street, as though even the building itself understood her reduced circumstances and had arranged her view accordingly. Adeline kept them scrupulously clean out of a stubbornness that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with refusing to let the town see her surrender to squalor along with everything else. She learned to make 40 cents stretch across a week, to mend her own stockings by lamplight, to walk the long way to the mercantile so she would not have to pass too close to the lumber yard now standing where her peach trees used to be. The women of Coldwater Bend were not unkind to her exactly, not in any way they would have named as cruelty, but they had begun, in the months since the foreclosure, to speak to her with the particular gentle condescension reserved for people whose luck had visibly run out, offering her their pity in place of their friendship, as though the two were interchangeable. Adeline accepted the pity, because refusing it would have cost more than she had left to spend, but she never once mistook it for warmth. It was Copper who noticed the auction notice first, in a manner of speaking, or rather, it was Copper's odd insistence on stopping at the depot fence 3 mornings running, sniffing at the rail spur with his hackles faintly raised, that made Adeline finally stop and read the notice nailed to the depot board herself. The railroad was clearing unserviceable rolling stock from the old spur behind the station, a dead-end track that had not seen active use since a small branch line was abandoned 9 years before. Among the lots was Boxcar 117, described in the terse language of railroad clerks as non-operational, structurally unsound, sold as is, buyer to remove or forfeit. Everyone assumed it would go to the scrap dealer from Larkspur, a heavy-set man named Odom who bought rusted iron by the pound and had already walked the yard twice, tapping the boxcar's flanks with a crowbar like a man testing a melon. Nobody expected the widow Fisk to show up to the auction at all, let alone to bid. But something in Adeline had shifted in the weeks since the foreclosure, something she could not entirely explain even to herself. She had begun walking past that dead spur on her way to the mercantile, and each time, Copper pulled toward it rather than away, the way a dog pulls toward a scent it cannot yet name. Dogs did not waste that kind of attention on nothing. Thomas had taught her that, years ago, watching a younger, sprier Copper freeze at the base of a peach tree the season before it dropped a hidden hollow full of a raccoon's stolen silverware. Adeline had laughed about that story for years. She was not laughing now. She was simply watching her dog, and trusting, in the quiet and slightly desperate way of someone with nothing else left to trust, that he was telling her something the rest of the world had not yet bothered to notice. What Adeline did not yet know, what even Copper, straining at that fence, could only sense in the way animals sense a coming storm, was that Boxcar 117 was not simply forgotten. It had been buried in paperwork on purpose, and there was exactly one man in Coldwater Bend who had spent 3 years quietly making sure nobody looked at it twice. The morning of the auction, the depot yard filled with the kind of crowd that gathers less out of interest than out of appetite for a spectacle. Odom the scrap dealer stood near the front with his crowbar and his confident slouch. Behind him clustered a dozen townsfolk who had, in the 8 months since the foreclosure, developed a habit of speaking about Adeline Fisk in the particular hushed tone reserved for people whose misfortune has become entertainment. She heard the word fool twice before the bidding even opened, and she heard Silas Pruitt's dry, unhurried voice somewhere near the depot steps remark to the station master that it was a shame when grief curdles into folly. She did not turn to look at him. She had learned, in 2 years of widowhood, exactly how much a person could survive without turning to look at the ones doing the talking. The auctioneer moved through the lots quickly, a broken handcar, a stack of split ties, a water tower valve assembly, until he reached lot 14. He described Boxcar 117 in the same flat, dismissive tone he'd used for the rest. Rusted through, wheels seized, interior water damaged, sold as is, no warranty implied or offered. Odom opened the bidding at $4, expecting, correctly, that no one would challenge him. And then Copper, who had been sitting obediently at Adeline's heel through the entire auction, suddenly stood, took 2 stiff steps toward the boxcar, and let out a single low, urgent whine. Not a bark, not a growl, but a sound Adeline had heard from him only once before, the night before Thomas's fever finally broke into something the doctor could no longer call ordinary influenza. It was the sound Copper made when he knew something before she did. Adeline raised her hand. $6, she said, and the yard went quiet enough that she could hear the wind moving through the dead grass along the spur. Odom, more amused than threatened, raised her to 7. She raised to 8, cutting deep into the $11 folded in her handkerchief, and felt the particular vertigo of a woman spending money she did not have on a thing she could not explain. There was laughter now, open and unkind, rippling through the crowd, the way it does when people sense they are about to be handed a story they'll tell for months. Someone near the back said loud enough to Carrie that the widow Fisk had lost an orchard, and was fixing to lose her mind next. Adeline kept her chin level, and her eyes on the auctioneer. Beside her, Copper had gone entirely still, watching the boxcar the way he used to watch the tree line at dusk, ears forward, weight forward, every part of him leaning toward something the rest of the yard could not see. Odom, unwilling to spend real money chasing a widow's foolishness for scrap he'd get regardless, dropped out at 9. The auctioneer's gavel came down on $10.50, nearly every coin Adeline had left in the world, and lot 14, boxcar 117, non-operational, structurally unsound, sold as is, belonged to her. The crowd's laughter followed her all the way to the depot office, where she signed the transfer papers with a hand that did not shake nearly as much as she expected it to, and where, for just a moment, she caught Silas Pruitt watching her from the platform with an expression that was not amusement at all, but something colder and far more careful, an expression she would not fully understand the meaning of until weeks later. That night, in the 2 rented rooms above the seamstress's shop, Adeline sat by the lamp, with Copper's head heavy on her knee, and did the arithmetic of her new life. She had, in total, 40 cents to her name, a boxcar she could not move, and a growing unshakable feeling that she had just done something either very stupid or very important, and that she would not know which, until she found the courage to go back and open it properly. She went back the next morning before sunrise, while the yard was still empty, and the frost still silvered the dead grass along the spur. Copper trotted ahead of her with a purpose she had not seen in him since Thomas used to take him rabbit hunting. Nose low, tail high and steady, moving not like a dog exploring, but like a dog returning somewhere he already knew. The boxcar's sliding door had rusted nearly shut, and it took Adeline the better part of 20 minutes with a pry bar borrowed from the livery to force it open enough to squeeze through the gap, the metal shrieking in protest, flakes of orange rust drifting down like a strange, bitter snow. Inside, the air smelled of old pine planking gone soft with damp, of iron oxide, and mouse nest, and the particular dry mineral smell of a space that had not felt sunlight in a very long time. Water had gotten in through a hole in the roof at some point, and left a dark, ruined stain across half the floorboards, and what little cargo remained, a few split crates, a coil of rotted rope, a stack of moldering feed sacks, looked, to any reasonable eye, exactly like the worthless scrap everyone had promised her it was. Adeline stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cold morning light slanting past her, and felt her stomach drop with the beginnings of a very expensive regret. Then Copper, who had slipped past her legs the moment the door opened, began scratching at the floorboards in the far corner with an intensity that startled her. Not the idle scratch of a dog settling in, but the frantic, single-minded digging of an animal who had found something and would not be talked out of it. He whined, low and insistent, glancing back at her over his shoulder, as if to ask why she was still standing in the doorway, when there was clearly work to be done. Adeline crossed the boxcar's uneven floor, knelt beside him in the damp and the dark, and ran her fingers along the boards, where his claws had already worn thin pale scratches into the old pine. It was only when her fingertips found the seam, too straight, too deliberate to be the natural gap between planks, that she understood Copper had not been digging at random at all. He had been digging at a door. And somewhere beneath that door lay the reason a respectable banker had spent 3 quiet years making sure Boxcar 117 stayed exactly where it was. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lantern light, with the pry bar and her bare, freezing fingers, to work the hidden floor panel loose. When it finally gave, it did not reveal a compartment so much as a shaft. A narrow iron ladder descending perhaps 6 feet into what she would later understand had been a reinforced strongbox car, disguised decades earlier beneath ordinary freight planking, the kind of hidden vault car that railroad paymasters had once used to move payroll gold safely through country still thick with outlaws. Copper went down the ladder before she could stop him, unafraid, tail wagging with an eagerness that told her more clearly than words that whatever waited below was not a danger, but a discovery. Adeline followed with the lantern held high, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it over the creak of the old iron rungs. The vault below was small, barely large enough for her to stand upright, its riveted iron walls dry and untouched by the water damage above. In the lantern light, she found 2 iron-strapped chests, their locks long since rusted to uselessness, and between them, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a leather satchel stamped with the seal of the Territorial Land and Rail Survey Office. Copper sat beside the satchel and thumped his tail against the iron floor, watching her with an expression she could only describe as proud, as though he had personally solved something enormous, and was waiting, quite reasonably, for her to catch up. Inside the chests, gold coin, territorial mint, more money stacked in careful rows than Adeline had seen in her entire life, payroll funds meant for railroad crews decades before, that had simply vanished from the historical record, after a robbery scare shut the line down early, and the vault car was quietly shunted onto a dead spur and forgotten, its existence buried in paperwork that only one man in Coldwater Bend had apparently ever bothered to dig up. Inside the satchel, original land survey documents, deed ledgers, and, the sheet that made Adeline's breath catch hardest of all, a set of records showing the true, original boundary lines of nearly every parcel along the valley's western edge, boundary lines that did not match the ones Silas Pruitt's bank had been quietly, legally, foreclosure by foreclosure, redrawing for the last 3 years. She sat on the cold iron floor of that hidden vault for a long time, Copper's warm weight pressed against her side, understanding at last why her dog had pulled toward that fence for 3 straight mornings, and understanding, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, that she had just found something powerful enough to change everything, and dangerous enough that the man who'd hidden it would not let her keep it quietly. She ran her thumb along the edge of one gold coin, feeling the worn stamp of the territorial mint beneath the grime of decades, and tried to imagine the men who had once been meant to receive this payroll, track crews and section hands who had likely gone unpaid, whose wages had simply vanished into a robbery scare, and a shunted railcar, and 3 decades of silence. It struck her, sitting there in the lantern light with the iron walls close around her, that this gold had already once belonged to people who worked hard and got nothing for it, and something in that thought settled into her chest like a small quiet promise she did not yet know how to keep. Copper, sensing the shift in her mood the way he always did, pressed his head beneath her hand and let out a long contented sigh, as if to say that whatever came next, he intended to see her through it, the same way he had seen her through every hard thing since Thomas died. It took 2 full trips up the narrow iron ladder, and the better part of the afternoon to haul the chests and the satchel up into the boxcar proper, Adeline's arms trembling with effort she hadn't used in months, her palms blistering against the rusted iron handles. She sent word to Willis at the depot, the only railroad employee she trusted enough to ask for help moving something so heavy without asking too many questions, and by dusk, the chests sat locked inside the depot's storage shed under a tarp, guarded, That first uneasy night, by Copper alone, curled at the shed door with his ears pricked toward every sound the dark wind carried. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Coldwater Bend, even word that was meant to travel slowly. It was the depot clerk, a nervous young man named Willis, who had helped Adeline haul the chests up from the vault car using the station's hand truck, who let the discovery slip over supper to his sister, who mentioned it to the seamstress, who mentioned it, within 2 days, to nearly everyone in town, including, inevitably, Silas Pruitt himself. By the time Adeline understood how quickly the secret had escaped her, Pruitt was already standing in the doorway of her rented rooms, with his hat in his hands, and an expression of carefully rehearsed concern, explaining, in his smooth, unhurried way, that the vault car and its contents were, in fact, unclaimed railroad property that had never lawfully transferred with the boxcar's scrap sale, and that as a longtime friend of the railroad's regional office, he would be only too happy to handle the matter properly on her behalf. It was, Adeline realized as she listened to him, the same voice he had used the day he foreclosed on her orchard, patient, reasonable, utterly certain of its own righteousness. And it was Copper, standing rigid at her side, with his hackles raised, and a low steady growl rumbling in his chest, who told her, more plainly than any lawyer could have, that whatever Silas Pruitt wanted from that vault, it was not on her behalf at all. She refused him at the door, as politely as her pounding heart allowed, and told him the transfer papers she'd signed at the depot office made no exceptions for what the boxcar contained. Sold as is, meaning exactly what it said. Pruitt's smile thinned, just slightly, just long enough for her to see something underneath it that she recognized, with a jolt, as fear. He left without argument. He did not leave quietly for long. What Adeline did not yet understand, as she bolted her door that night with the satchel of survey records hidden beneath her floorboards, was that Silas Pruitt's fear had nothing to do with gold at all, and everything to do with the fact that those old boundary lines, if anyone with real authority ever compared them to his bank's current land maps, would prove he had been stealing from half the town in plain daylight for 3 straight years. Over the following days, Pruitt's approach shifted from persuasion to pressure, in the patient, deniable way of a man who had learned to ruin people without ever raising his voice. He called in a note on the seamstress's shop, forcing the shop's owner to warn Adeline, with genuine regret, that she could no longer afford to let the rooms above go unrented to a boarder who couldn't pay. He spread word through the mercantile that the widow Fisk's railroad treasure was likely stolen property she'd have no legal claim to, poisoning what little sympathy the town might otherwise have spared her. And on the third night, someone, Pruitt would never be foolish enough to be seen doing it himself, tried the lock on the depot's storage shed, where Willis had helped her secure the gold chests, only to be driven off by Copper's furious, sustained barking before a single latch gave way. The dog was never harmed. He made certain of that himself, placing his body squarely between the shed door and the dark, standing his ground with a ferocity that surprised even Adeline, who had only ever known him as gentle. Pruitt came to her once more before she left for the county seat, and this time he did not bother with his rehearsed gentleness at all. He found her at the orchard's edge, standing among the blighted, half-dead trees that had once been her whole life, and told her plainly, in a voice gone flat and cold, that a woman in her position, widowed, penniless, with no family left to speak for her, would do well to remember how quickly a town's sympathy could curdle into suspicion if word got out that she was hoarding railroad gold that wasn't rightfully hers. He reminded her, almost gently, almost as though he believed he was doing her a kindness, that Thomas Fisk had died owing a small balance on his original land note, a debt Pruitt's bank could revive at any time if she proved uncooperative, and that grief-stricken widows, who made accusations against respected bankers, rarely fared well in front of a county judge, who owed that same banker his own mortgage. It was the most honest he had ever been with her, and it was also, Adeline understood, a mistake, because it was the first time he had shown her exactly how frightened he truly was beneath the tailored coat and the unhurried voice. Copper, standing between them with his hackles raised the entire time, did not growl this time. He simply stared at Pruitt, unblinking, until the banker turned and walked back toward town without another word, and Adeline found she was no longer afraid of him at all, only certain, in the marrow-deep way grief and hardship teach a person to be certain, that she would see this through no matter what it cost her. It was Willis, frightened but stubbornly decent, who finally gave Adeline the peace she needed. Cornered by his own conscience, he admitted that Pruitt had come to him months earlier, before the auction was even announced, asking specifically about the old strongbox car on the dead spur, and offering a discreet bonus if Willis made sure it stayed listed as unremarkable scrap, and sold quietly, cheaply, with no attention drawn to it at all. Willis, junior and underpaid, and unwilling to understand exactly what he was participating in, had done as he was told, until the day Adeline outbid Odom, and the whole careful plan came apart in front of the entire town. Armed with Willis's account, and the survey satchel's original boundary records, Adeline did the one thing Silas Pruitt had clearly never expected a grieving ruined widow to do. She went, not to the sheriff, whom Pruitt had dined with regularly for 3 years, but directly to the territorial land office in the county seat, 2 days' ride away, carrying the satchel wrapped in oilcloth, and Copper riding watchful in the wagon bed the entire way, growling at nothing and everything, as though he understood exactly how much depended on that satchel arriving safely. The territorial surveyor who examined the documents was a precise, unhurried man named Garrity, who had spent 11 years cataloging land disputes across the region, and had, it turned out, long harbored his own quiet suspicions about the unusual speed and consistency with which one particular Coldwater Bend banker's foreclosures always seemed to redraw property lines in his own favor. Garrity compared the original survey stakes and ledgers Adeline had brought against the bank's current recorded boundaries, and found, within a single afternoon, no fewer than 9 parcels, including the 11 acres of Adeline's own former orchard, where Pruitt's bank had quietly shifted lines by anywhere from a few feet to nearly half an acre. Always in the bank's favor, always buried in paperwork too dense for an ordinary landowner to challenge. Garrity rode back to Coldwater Bend with Adeline himself, carrying a formal writ of land audit, and, not incidentally, considerable professional satisfaction at finally having the evidence to act on suspicions he'd nursed for years. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation the town might have expected from a dime novel, but something Adeline found, in the end, far more satisfying: a slow, methodical, entirely legal unraveling. Pruitt was summoned before the county land commissioner. His bank's records were seized and audited line by line. The stolen boundary shifts were reversed, parcel by parcel, restoring rightful acreage to nearly a dozen families across the valley, including, at long last, the 11 acres of the Fisk orchard itself, still scarred by blight, but no longer legally out of her reach. Faced with proof of systematic fraud spanning 3 years, and with the territorial office moving to revoke his bank's charter entirely, Pruitt did what such men so often do when the careful architecture of their reputation finally collapses. He tried to flee in the night with what liquid assets remained, only to be stopped at the county line by Garrity's deputies, his fine coat and unhurried voice doing nothing at all to slow the reading of the warrant. But it was not Pruitt's arrest that the town would talk about for years afterward. It was what Adeline chose to do next. With more gold in her possession than most of Coldwater Bend had ever seen in one place, and with a decision to make that would either confirm every unkind thing the townsfolk had said about her, or prove, once and for all, exactly who she really was. The payroll gold, once the territorial office finished its inquiry, was legally hers, found on land she had lawfully purchased, unclaimed by any living heir of the original railroad payroll office, its ownership settled cleanly in her favor by a magistrate, who seemed almost amused at how thoroughly the case had turned the town's gossip on its head. Adeline could have taken that gold and left Coldwater Bend entirely, could have bought a fine house in the county seat, and never again endured the stares of people who had laughed at her in the depot yard. She thought about it, in the quiet nights that followed, with Copper's steady breathing beside her in the dark. But she thought too, about Willis, and about the other families whose acreage had been quietly stolen the same way hers had, about the seamstress who'd been forced to threaten her own tenant out of fear of a note called in, about a town that had been unkind to her, mostly because it had been frightened, itself, in ways it did not fully understand. So Adeline Fisk did the thing that made her, in the end, into precisely the kind of story people tell for years without needing to embellish it. She used a portion of the recovered gold to restore the orchard, and a larger portion still to establish a modest community fund at the Mercantile, low-interest loans for families rebuilding after Pruitt's fraudulent foreclosures, administered not by a bank but by a small elected committee that included, at her insistence, both Willis and Garrity's local land clerk, so that no single hand could ever again quietly redraw a boundary line in the dark. The old boxcar itself she had hauled, at considerable expense, to a spot beside the restored orchard, where she had it repainted, and fitted with shelves, and a modest sign, and turned it into a small trading post, that sold preserves, seed, and second-hand tools, at fair prices to families who could no longer easily afford the Mercantile's markups. She named it, without much debate, Copper's Corner, and hung above its door a small brass plaque explaining, in a handful of plain sentences, that it had once been sold as worthless scrap to a woman everyone in town had called a fool. The day the new boundary markers were driven into the ground at the edge of the Fisk orchard, Adeline stood with Garrity's clerk and watched the surveyor's chain stretch out across grass that had, for 3 years, technically belonged to someone else's ledger, and felt something in her chest unclench that she had not even realized was still holding its breath. Copper ran the new boundary line twice at a dead sprint, nose down, tail high, as though he needed to confirm with his own body that the ground beneath him had, at long last, been returned to where it truly belonged, and when he finally trotted back to her side, he pressed his head against her knee, and let out a low, satisfied huff, that made the clerk laugh out loud. It was such a small thing, a dog running the edge of a field, and yet Adeline would remember it for the rest of her life, as the precise moment the last 3 years finally, fully let her go. By the following autumn, the orchard bore its first small harvest, in 3 years, and Coldwater Bend's memory of the widow Fisk had reshaped itself entirely, the way towns eventually do when they are forced to admit they misjudged someone. Children walked out of their way after school just to scratch Copper's ears at the trading post door, and old Odom the scrap dealer, who had lost the bid on Lot 14 for $4 less than its true worth, took to telling the story at the tavern with the particular relish of a man who'd rather claim closeness to a good story than admit he'd nearly walked away with the greatest misfortune of his life. Nobody laughed at Adeline Fisk in the depot yard anymore. When they spoke of her now, it was with the quiet, slightly embarrassed respect people reserve for someone who turned out, all along, to have been right. We think about that morning often, the frost on the dead grass, the shrieking hinge of a boxcar door nobody else wanted to open, and a red hound with a crooked ear who somehow understood, long before his mistress did, that the things a town throws away are not always worthless, only unseen. If you found a hidden piece of history buried beneath the ordinary, overlooked corners of your own life, would you keep it quietly to yourself, or would you do as Adeline did, and let it become something the whole town could finally share? Until next time, stay close.